welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major recent macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. I know I said recent developments, and by that yardstick, what we're going to discuss today, the UN Summit on Climate Action held in New York, doesn't quite fit that description, not in these days of instant karma. But we thought it important to put some distance between the event and the discussion, simply because in the charged up atmosphere post the summit, especially post the 16-year-old Greta Thunberg's impassioned speech, it would have been very difficult for viewers to share our dispassionate view of the issues raised. And this program, as you all know, is about taking a hard look at issues, regardless of how emotive. Also, climate change is much bigger than the events at a single summit. So in this edition, we're going to talk about the how, the plan of action, rather than the fact of climate change and its frightening consequences, as evidenced in the latest report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released soon after the summit. Is there a way out? Prime Minister Modi in the address to the summit called for global behavioral change. Note the word global because that sums up the crux of what ails the present efforts to tackle climate change. There just isn't enough global consensus. Forget the US, where President Trump refuses to even accept the fact of climate change and has pulled his country out of the Paris Agreement. Even the rest of the world is unwilling to put its money where its mouth is, despite being almost entirely responsible for the present state of affairs. However, developing countries like India can't make much progress without financial support from the developed world. So are we condemned to forever go round in circles? To answer that question and come up with possible answers, we have with us a panel of experts. Pradipta Ghosh, former Secretary Environment, Government of India, Professor Shrikant Gupta, Environmental Professor at Delhi School of Economics, and Purnamita Das Gupta, Chair Environmental Economics and Head Environmental and Resource Economics, Institute of Economic Growth, New Delhi. Thank you so much for joining us. My first question to each of you in turn is, now that Thunberg has become the global icon for youngsters, will we see greater traction from the rest of the world? Will we get the Western world to put money, as I said, where their mouth is? Dr. Pradipta Ghosh.
Well, first of all, I would like to give a message to Greta Thunberg that she should address her next campaign to change in the lifestyles of her peers in the Western world. Are they willing to give up meat? Are they willing to take public transport? Are they willing, to recycle everything possible? We need to look at these aspects. It's the behavioral change, as Prime Minister Modi has correctly said, and it's a comprehensive behavioral change across all modes of consumption. The consequences will be in modes of production, but the key is the change in consumption patterns. Now,
has she awakened the conscience of her, seniors and older generation, as it were?
Well,
because they are the ones who make policy.
I think it is early days, but we must understand that addressing climate change in mitigation and adaptation will need a whole-scale restructuring of the global economy. So that is something that is easier said than done, and it will take several decades. It also depends on crucial innovations in technology. And of course, the fact is that the financing models for infrastructure have to evolve for these new technologies, financial models and the business models.
Yeah, ultimately it's finance at the bottom of it all. Shrikant, the German government led by Angela Merkel has unveiled a 60 billion climate protection package to reduce greenhouse emission. But that's more than the economic stimulus that they announced after the 2008 crisis. But the German public is not at all happy with the fact that they'll have to pay more by way of taxes, etc. So, and we also saw the Yellow Vest movement in France. So, do you think we'll really get countries to part with money to do what they're talking about?
Well, obviously, it's a challenge. If it had been easy, it would have happened long back.
Right.
But going back to your earlier question, if we in India look at things and how things are, it would seem that climate change is happening on another planet. I work at the Delhi University. If I go around with my students, their primary concern, unfortunately, are very short term. Getting jobs, this is placement season. If you look at a news cycle, you hardly see any mention of climate change. Yes, of course, there is this brief burst when
enthusiasm,
yes, when there are the headlines and so on. But if you really look at it very seriously, if you just go through our newspapers, through our channels, barring this show, of course, you find very little sense of urgency, which certainly has to be, because the scientific data is very, very serious. And the report that you were mentioning has just said that this 5-year period, 2014 to 19, is the warmest ever recorded in human history. So things are very serious. But I think in our country, the general level of awareness and urgency is overshadowed by other
far more pressing problems.
Well,
I don't know whether they're more pressing is very difficult to say.
Well, yes. So we are in that situation. If you look at our parliament and just go back and see how many questions have been raised on climate change.
Almost none, perhaps.
Probably a few in the last few years. So I think that there is this clear dissonance between the reality of climate change and in our own public discourse, how seriously people are taking it, and of course the fact that the richer countries are not going to do enough. But we must accept the fact that India has to go it alone in a way of mitigation and adaptation.
Purnamita, are you more hopeful now that the movement seems to have been taken over by youngsters? Or do you believe that while it might make headlines, policy ultimately is not made by them? Many of them, in fact, are even too young to vote or contribute money to political parties. So they are unlikely to make much of a difference to formulating policy. Would you agree, Purnamita?
If you want to impact and make a difference, every bit matters. And that was something that I think the 1.5 degree special report of the IPCC helped highlight, and all the subsequent special reports have also done their bit on that. So I think the youth can do a tremendous amount. It's not, political engagement is of course something we need to move things forward at a certain level. But if you consider the fact that awareness, the very fact that you and I are sitting in this studio today and talking about Greta, and it means that there is something out there which can pick up and make hopefully many more ask and say, how dare you, with the kind of passion that she has brought to the global, audience.
That's a tragedy here. You know, all of us, yes, we might all say, how dare you, but unless we follow that talk with action, and that's what I fear is missing. In fact, Pradipto, in a discussion paper prior to the New York conference, India made it very clear that in the absence of the developed world contributing to climate action finance, as agreed upon earlier, India can only aspire to implement its already promised climate actions. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean we are backtracking and we're not really serious about even, living up to what we'd committed earlier, Pradipto?
Well, you see, if you look at our INDCs, which were provided after the Paris conference, the total investment was of the order of $2.6 trillion, which is till 2030, which is like like a full year's GDP as far as we are concerned. That's a huge outlay. But India had made it clear even at that point in time that the specific actions and the overall target of a reduction in the GDP intensity of the economy is contingent on the provision of finance, technology and capacity building. So it is not a new position. It is a reiteration of a long-standing position of India and all developing countries, and its foundation lies in Article 4.3 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change.
So, Srikanth, since that's not coming, in fact, according to the Climate Action Tracker, India is one of the 7 developing countries which say if these developing countries adhere to what they had promised, then we'll be able to prevent that kind of global warming. But is it fair to put the onus only on developing countries? Because all the 7 countries that are listed are developing countries.
No, I don't think the climate tracker is right. I just don't think that even if India's emissions were to drop to zero by some hypothetical situation, the trajectory of the temperature rise would change. I just don't think that until you have all these other countries in the north doing their bit, just these developing countries are going to do the job. I just don't think that is.
So is this the developed world again trying to arm twist the developing?
Well, I don't know what the PR and what the subtext in all of this is, but I must mention here that I was hoping that with this newfound chemistry between our leader and the leader of the US, that somehow that could also have helped nudge the US. I certainly agree with Dr. Ghosh that the amounts of money that we would require are very, very significant.
Yes.
But having said that, whatever are the win-win opportunities in terms of investing in public transport,
Sure.
which will reduce our dependence on imported oil
Yeah.
and contribute
Yeah,
to
yeah.
reduction of gases, greenhouse
That we
gases,
can do, yes.
those sorts of things we should do, and adaptation.
Adaptation.
Climate proofing the Indian economy
Absolutely.
is, I think, our number one, or should be our number one priority.
Purnima, climate negotiations underpinned by the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. But as in the context of global trade, is it just a lot of hogwash? Sounds very fair and all the rest of it, but doesn't really mean anything in reality, because the Western world is not willing to share a greater share of the burden. Purnamita?
Well, you know, it's like this. If you go back to what the climate tracker itself was saying when all the NDCs were submitted, it was applauding India by saying that our commitments were very commensurate with trying to get at a 2 degrees centigrade target. And today what you see actually is that a lot of the promises, as you very rightly said, do not seem to be backed by similar commitments in terms of flows of technology or finance and so on and so forth. But what we do see, on the other hand, I would like to stress, is that there is this understanding that the climate change impacts are going to be so severe and unfortunately differentiated that whether you like it or not, some countries, including India, have started thinking about what they can do on their own. And in that context, I would say that one of the things that really sort of, I think, gives me hope is that moving beyond pen and paper and the camera, what we do see is that there are initiatives, albeit naive, albeit at the beginning stages, but at the same time, if you consider that some companies, Indian companies, have started setting an internal carbon price. If you consider that there are studies coming out which say that benefit cost ratios can be higher if you start sensitizing your investments and your asset creation to climate impacts. So I think there are small beginnings, and willy-nilly, whether we like it or not, we have to do our bit.
Okay, so you're a little bit more hopeful, but Pradipta, I think you wanted to say something very quickly, because it's time for us to slip into a very short break after that.
Well, common but differentiated responsibility is one way of saying that equity should drive all global actions on climate change. Now, the point is that the developed countries have forever ducked the question of equity.
Okay, I'm afraid it's time, as I said, to slip into a very short break. Please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the issue of climate change, but with a gap after the UN summit, purely because we want to look at it in very rational, dispassionate terms. We thought it's important to have this interval where people can think about the harder issues at stake. Pradipta, India has actually said, and I quote, that it will suitably recalibrate its actions only after completion of a global stock-taking or the progress under the Paris Agreement. Now, you were saying before the break that India has actually delivered on whatever it has promised. But have we really, under the Paris Agreement, to have whatever we committed, have we delivered?
Well, I was not talking of what we have delivered till now.
Okay.
Though basically it seems we are on track, and certainly we are on track with respect to the JG intensity of the economy. But the question is that global stocktake in 2023, by which we will, the global community will evaluate what different countries have done. But the point is, what they should do, what burdens they should take, have to be premised on equity. And we cannot avoid a serious discussion on what are the appropriate norms of equity in 2023 if we are to move forward to 2030 and beyond.
Srikanth, it is the fact that you need equity, but it's also very difficult for the developing to take equity to the developed world. And there was a fact that there was a hope rather that in a world where everything has a price, there was a lot of hope that when the world came up with the idea of the emissions trading system. But unfortunately, that really hasn't worked. Why has that not worked?
There are a number of reasons, but just a very quick comment on what Dr. Ghosh said. To paraphrase, it's a question of what's called contraction and convergence.
Okay.
That there is some amount of contraction also from the countries that he was talking about. On emissions trading, yes, I guess the basic stumbling block is again the initial allocation of who gets what quotas. The emissions trading system in the EU, in the European Union, is obviously quite salient and has been reasonably successful. China, as always, has taken the lead in a national emissions trading scheme that it is rolling out. Emissions trading is certainly, ideally, for an economist, we do understand that a carbon price, either through carbon taxes or carbon trading, is the way forward, which puts a price on carbon. That certainly is an aspiration. Another aspect of emissions trading, which, for example, Joseph Stiglitz and all have talked about, is globally harmonized but internally levied carbon taxes. So each country levies its own carbon tax, so the revenue remains within the country, but these are globally harmonized. And if a country reneges, then there are border adjustments.
Purnamita, you think that the idea itself was flawed to begin with the cap being set too high, so that the price was much too low and so on. So can we tweak it, as Srikanth is suggesting?
You see, the carbon price is something that it ends up being a fairly negotiated sort of an instrument. If you consider who sets the who gains from a carbon price, who are the potential losers from the imposition of a carbon price, you see there's a lot of asymmetry. I mean, who gains in the long run from putting a carbon price as a set of very differentiated individual agents, individual beings, humanity in future, and so on, whereas the immediate losers may be people who have big stakes, who are powerful, like the fossil fuel industry, and so on and so forth. So carbon prices typically have always been subject to certain amounts of what I would call negotiated outcomes, and we haven't, and they have their success and the failure of schemes like an ETS depends on a whole host of factors. So, which is why, I think carbon price is very important, but it can't be carbon prices are never going to reflect the social cost of carbon, is my belief.
Okay. Pradipta, you wanted to add something to it?
You would have to rely on more disaggregated sort of instruments and multiple instruments. I would say multiple instruments at a time.
Pradipta, you wanted to?
Stiglitz's proposal
is
actually geared to having a uniform marginal cost of carbon abatement globally.
Okay.
This is the principle of efficiency.
Right.
The developed world has always sought to deflect the issue of equity and try to conflate that equity is the same as efficiency. And I would humbly submit that that is not the case.
So since we're not able to force the Western world, the developed world, to think in terms of equity, can we at least get sufficient consensus to make them think in terms of something like a Marshall Plan that we had out of the Second World War to rebuild the economy? Can we have a similar plan where all countries contribute?
I think it will be very difficult until and unless Greta Thunberg's young peers are able to reach a consensus among themselves and actually accomplish the drastic changes in lifestyle that are necessary. And I cannot see the United States, for example, giving up on eating meat, which is the world's biggest environmental problem.
But Srikanth, you've always been very big on things like mitigation and enhancing our adaptive capacity, etc. So is that the way to go? I mean, how much of a difference will it make, even if we do all that? How much of a difference will it make if India alone does all that?
Well, three things. First, mitigation is important for us in the sense that it helps us exploit the win-win opportunities. As I've already mentioned, there are things that we can do, as I've already mentioned, on, say, moving towards public transport, etc., which is good for our air quality, it's good for our import bill, and so on. Mitigation is important, but please bear in mind that even if India's emissions were to drop to zero overnight by some magic, the temperature trajectory would very, very marginally change.
So then does it open it up to the argument saying that if it won't make a difference, why should we go down that path?
No, I'm not saying that. I already said that there are these synergies with other issues like, as I said, our imports of oil, our local air quality issues, where we should definitely do it. So it's not entirely that it is all altruistic. But that's the first point. The second point, as I've already mentioned, is that climate change is going to happen. And we are already seeing the futility or the lack of ability to come to an agreement. In that meantime, we are heading towards climate disaster. I would like to use the analogy that we are debating about the order of the deck chairs on the Titanic while the Titanic is heading towards the iceberg, and that's something I like to allude to.
So do you see the lack of consensus even within the country, or is it lack of consensus globally?
We were talking about the lack of consensus globally,
What about
the
within the
unwillingness
country?
of the richer countries to
Right.
the consensus within the country. I've already mentioned that, at least from my vantage point of working and teaching with younger students and so on. To be very honest, I'm very disappointed in their, I mean, Greta Thunberg is from a rich country. I don't know about her peers, but I can tell you categorically about the Indian youth. And not just Indian youth who are watching this English language program, but Indian youth by and large have very, very more prosaic concerns.
So on that rather despondent note, Purnamita, let me turn to you. How can India marry the twin goals, the promise of a 5 trillion economy, just a few years from now, with our commitment on the climate front, if we don't get the funds promised to us? In fact, there's very little of the money that the West has promised that has really come our way. How do you marry these twin goals? And you can't say which is more important, because ultimately we do need to grow, we do need to prosper to move people out of below the poverty line. So how do we do that, Purnamita?
So there is this question of how you develop and what you do right now. How is it going to pan out in a world that goes much beyond 2030? And in that context, I would say climate synergies are very important in understanding or taking decisions on what you do to develop, whether it's in hard infrastructure, whether it's in terms of building skills and capacities, whether it's in terms of, getting into dialogues with neighboring states on transformations, coordinations on river basins, I think, or whether it's just strengthening states in implementing their state action plans on climate change. So I think there's a lot of stuff that actually emanates at subnational and regional levels as well. And that is where I think there's hope and scope. But finally, I would like to also add that we have to start seeing the private sector and all agents apart from the government also as potential agents of change.
Except, Purnamita, I can interrupt you, all this costs money, and when the government is worried about fiscal deficit, where are we going to find the money? So before we conclude this program, because I'm running out of time, Pradipto, if we had to choose 1, 2, 3, what are the things that we can do that don't cost too much money?
Well, for a start, what we could do is that enable urban commuter transport to move to shared and to mass. I'm saying mass, not public, deliberately, transport, which it's something that we can do without incurring too much upfront or economic costs. But the point is that addressing adaptation, and for example, our biggest adaptation problem is about water resources. It is going to need resources on a scale which is comparable to that of mitigation.
So can you add to it, what can we do that doesn't cost too much money and yet gives us, a lot of mileage?
Mythili, you're asking an economist if there is a free lunch. I mean, come on.
No, with less money. With less money.
Okay. So I would again echo the 2 points that Dr. Ghosh made. One is efficiencies. Our efficiencies in power generation or removing our inefficiencies in local transport. We live in a city with so much inefficiency in our transport systems. So making our transport systems more efficient, our power generation more efficient would definitely be, again, a kind of a low-hanging fruit, if you will. And then certainly, as he has rightly mentioned, to insulate our economy to the extent possible from the pernicious effects of climate change, which will happen in any case, will definitely be, should be a priority of our policymakers. And I really think that the window of action, I'm sorry to be pessimistic, has very rapidly closed.
Purnamita, I know you are also an economist. I'm going to ask you the same tough question that Srikanth said I shouldn't ask an economist, that everything has a price. But are there any things that are not so expensive which India can do to at least ensure that things are not as bleak as they seem at the moment?
I would say that there are these big ticket things. So when we talk about transformation, we talk about big ticket things like removing CO2 from the air, right, from the atmosphere, removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Yes, that costs a lot of money. And we don't even know where we are in terms of the technology for it. But in terms of innovations, in which regard, I think whether you call it jugaad or whatever you call it, Indians have done very well. And I think, therefore, once we realize that if a cyclone Fani hits you, we applaud ourselves, and rightly so, on being able to reduce mortality. But the next step is we also have to bear the consequences of the fact that, you've invested in infrastructure, which now needs to all be put in place. The economy has lost crores of rupees in infrastructure that is gone, in the damages that have been caused, and you have to recover from it. And so if you consider that aspect, I think slowly we will have to build in that climate sensitivity and the additional cost. And there are places where we don't need to do this with too much additional cost perhaps, and increasingly that is becoming apparent. You see, when companies, for instance, have started building in flood risks and flood management as part of working out how much of what their civil engineering costs are going to be, right? So I think small steps are possible, and that transformation is going to come through small incremental steps. Okay. Add-ons, no doubt more costs, no doubt about it, but maybe incremental costs that we can take on board.
Okay, Purnamita. So on that slightly more optimistic note, very slightly more optimistic note in the panel discussion that has otherwise been quite depressing, I'm afraid it's time for us to wrap up this program. Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh, Srikanth, as well as Purnamita, for joining us. I think the key takeaway is that there is something that India can do, not very much, not very expensive, but we must not ignore the opportunity and must continue down that path. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.